Okay, so let's go over some cell organelles and cell structure. So we've spent quite a bit of time talking about the cell membrane and the proteins that it contains that act in an assortment of ways to maintain homeostasis. Okay, so in within the cell, there's quite a few organelles, and we're gonna go over some of the common ones. Okay, so there's an organelle called the mitochondria, and the mitochondria, one of its main responsibilities is energy production. That is where cellular aerobic metabolism takes place. So the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, where glucose is converted to CO2 and water, and what's called the electron transport system that results in production of ATP. That all occurs in the mitochondria. Okay, so the only part of glucose metabolism that occurs in the cytoplasm is where glucose is initially converted to pyruvate that does not require any oxygen. Okay, and it makes a very small amount of energy. So after that, the rest of the production of energy from glucose metabolism takes place in the mitochondria. So the vast majority of ATP production is in the mitochondria with the Krebs cycle and the electron transport system. Okay, so what about lysosomes? So lysosomes are responsible for digestive functions in the cell. Okay, so they have an ability to absorb waste within them and then take that waste to the cell membrane and excrete that waste into the extracellular space. So within the lysosomes, there's digestive enzymes, and when waste is accumulated or taken into the lysosomes are able to process that waste and then bring it to the cell surface and secrete it or excrete it out of the cell itself. Okay, so let's move on to the Golgi apparatus. And the Golgi apparatus, it's an interesting name. It is an organelle that is responsible for packaging proteins into what are called vesicles or vesicles, so little round packages with a membrane around them. And they take the proteins that the cell just made and they can deliver them. They can go right to the cell membrane surface and release them out into the extracellular space. Or they can be released within the body. So they're really a packaging area for protein production and delivery of proteins. That's the main function of the Golgi apparatus. The nucleus, that's where the DNA resides, right? So that's where mRNA is copied to leave the nucleus to go into the cytoplasm, to then be copied by the ribosomes on the endoplasmic reticulum. Okay, so the nucleus is the genetic information of the cell. The ribosomes we've spoken about, they're responsible for protein synthesis along with the mRNA that they copy. And where does this whole process take place? Well, it takes place on the rough endoplasmic reticulum. That's where protein synthesis takes place Why is it rough? Because the ribosomes are stuck to the endoplasmic reticulum and they're copying mRNA. The endoplasmic reticulum is also partly responsible for lipid metabolism, and that's the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Okay, so there's two functions of the endoplasmic reticulum, the protein synthesis, and what happens after that. There's packaging of the proteins, and then the Golgi apparatus is going to also be responsible for packaging the proteins, and also the lipid metabolism on the endoplasmic reticulum. Okay, so let's talk a bit more about the mitochondria. So this particular organelle has, of course, a membrane around it, and its main purpose is to obtain the energy that's in carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, and produce ATP. Okay, so fats and proteins can enter the Krebs cycle in different parts and also be broken down for energy, just like glucose can. Okay, so the body has an ability to take in carbohydrates, break them down to glucose. Glucose in the cytoplasm will just be broken down to pyruvate and make a little bit of ATP, and then the lion's share of metabolism of glucose that then becomes water and CO2 is in the mitochondria, and that's where most of the ATP is produced. Okay, and that's from the Krebs cycle and the electron transport system. Okay, now fats and proteins can enter this cycle at different areas and be converted in the mitochondria to also CO2 and H2O and give off ATP. Okay, so it's not like the mitochondria just processes glucose. It can fit in fatty acids and amino acids if it wants to use them as energy as well. Okay. In general, the body doesn't like to break down its proteins, and because proteins are basically your muscles. Your muscles are essentially made up of proteins. So if the body is choosing to break down proteins, it means that it's typically exhausted its carbohydrate stores, and it's also used its fat stores. So proteins would be one of the last energy sources the body would want to access. Okay, it'll definitely go through the carbohydrates and the fats first. Okay, so when we're talking about glucose metabolism, we're at the bottom of the slide now. Glycolysis is the term that we use for glucose being converted to pyruvate. No oxygen required, and if there wasn't any oxygen in the cell, that would be the end of glucose metabolism, right? It would be anaerobic, no oxygen around. And again, produces very little ATP. But typically, when there is oxygen around, the products of glycolysis in the cytoplasm, being pyruvate, will then go to the mitochondria, go through the Krebs cycle in the mitochondrial matrix, and will be finally processed to H2O and CO2, which can leave the cell. Okay, CO2 can diffuse right across the cell membrane and soak in water, and it produces tremendous amounts of ATP. So 36 ATP are produced in this process by a glucose molecule. Okay, and that's the electron transport chain. in the mitochondrial membrane. Okay, so the mitochondria is really the energy and ATP producing organelle. So you've heard this term before, glycolysis, and that is the process of the breakdown of, or the initial breakdown of glucose in the cell, cytoplasm. Okay, it hasn't made it to the mitochondria yet. It has no requirement for oxygen, but because of that, it also will produce very little ATP. And the end product of glycolysis is pyruvic acid or pyruvate, which can then be converted into lactic acid if oxygen isn't present. Okay? If oxygen is present, the pyruvate or pyruvic acid enters the mitochondria and goes through the aerobic cycle or the Krebs cycle to generate H2O and CO2, and in the process producing 36 ATP. So there's a big difference between just glycolysis and the entire glucose metabolism through the Krebs cycle and the electron transport system in terms of how much energy is produced. Okay, only 2 ATP is produced by glycolysis, and then of course you also have pyruvate with that. Okay, and that's assuming that there's no oxygen. If there's oxygen, the process will continue on into the mitochondria. Okay, so aerobic metabolism of a cell means in the setting of oxygen, right? And that's going to produce the maximum amount of ATP. So 34 ATPs will be produced by the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain in the mitochondria, and 2 will come from glycolysis. Okay, so a total of 36 ATP with aerobic metabolism. So this is a very efficient system to get maximum energy. Anaerobic metabolism doesn't require any oxygen, only takes place in the cytoplasm, and it results in pyruvic acid and only 2 ATP. So you can see there's a huge difference in energy production, and if there's no oxygen, you can imagine that the cell is not going to survive very long on anaerobic metabolism. Okay, it requires too much energy to maintain all of its functions, including the sodium-potassium pump, that if the cell remains anaerobic, it becomes ischemic, meaning lack of oxygen, and then finally it'll infarct and die, right? So infarct or infarction means death of cells. Okay, so anaerobic metabolism, the pyruvate will convert to lactic acid, and then 2 ATP are produced. And the lactic acid is the pain that you would feel in your muscles when the body had to convert to anaerobic metabolism, because it could not get enough oxygen to maintain the level of activity that you were asking of it. Okay, so lactic acidosis acidosis is produced in the cells and is released into the bloodstream, and that's those painful muscles that you get, and that was from anaerobic metabolism. Okay, so hopefully we're getting more comfortable with this, with glucose metabolism. So you have glucose that has entered cells. How did it enter the cell? In the setting of having had insulin at a receptor. Glycolysis occurred, which resulted in only 2 ATPs and pyruvic acid or pyruvate. If there's oxygen present, we take the lower line, Most of the time, luckily, oxygen is present, so it goes to the mitochondria, where in the Krebs cycle, combined with the electron transport, you get another 34 ATP. Without oxygen, pyruvate cannot go through the Krebs cycle, since it requires oxygen for that process, and you develop lactic acid, and you are left with 2 ATP. So you can see how important this Krebs cycle is to energy production in the cell, right? So every cell in your body is doing this to keep on making ATP. And you can also imagine what happens when parts of your body, whether it's your kidney, your heart, your brain, has a blockage of the artery that was feeding it, right? So if you had a large part of your heart that was being supplied by a large artery, and that artery becomes blocked, all those cells become anaerobic. And if they stay anaerobic for hours, they're going to have ischemia, right? Ischemia is lack of oxygen. And finally, if the blockage remains in the artery, you're going to have myocardial infarction. So cell death of the myocardial cells. That's it. So we could have death of a leg in peripheral vascular disease. So if we have a blocked artery going to our leg and it doesn't open up, or we're unable to open the occluded artery, you will have ischemia first of your leg, meaning the cells are starting to die, but nothing's died yet. And then finally, infarction of the leg, meaning cellular death. Okay, and that's all because of the lack of oxygen. Okay, so we've gone through this already. So the mitochondria, through the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, produces 34 ATP, and this involves a series of reactions, starting with a molecule called acetyl-CoA from pyruvic acid breakdown. Okay, that's in the mitochondria, and then the electron transport system or chain requires oxygen to produce the ATP, and ATP is the energy currency of cells to run all of the systems in the cells. Okay, and when ATP releases energy, it breaks down to adenosine diphosphate. So by breaking off a phosphate, it releases energy, and the body uses that energy for a whole bunch of different processes. Okay, so here's the big picture of glucose metabolism. It starts with glycolysis in the cytoplasm, where glucose is converted to pyruvate, and that produces 2 ATP. Followed by that, pyruvate enters the mitochondria and is converted to acetyl-CoA. That enters the Krebs cycle, or another term for it is the citric acid cycle. That produces a small amount of ATP as well. And following that, you have the electron transport system, which is going to make most of the ATP. So what's called oxidative phosphorylation. So converting ADP to ATP in the process, in the setting of oxygen, right? And during this process, you're giving off CO2, you're giving off H2O, and you're using oxygen.